Reduction Roadmap. How to achieve ambitious emission reduction targets. Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about architecture, urbanism, cities, and many more. Welcome to today's discussion on the Reduction Roadmap, a new Danish research project aimed at reducing carbon emissions in the building industry in the line with the Paris Agreement goals. Since you are listening to this podcast, and I hope that this is maybe not the first episode of Urbcast that you are listening to, I hope that you are aware that the building industry is responsible for a significant portion of the global energy consumption and also the greenhouse gas emissions, making it a critical sector in the fight against climate change. The project we're gonna discuss today, the Reduction Roadmap, provides a comprehensive approach to achieving the necessary emission reductions, and it is developed by a partnership of Danish firms, leading researchers and NGOs. Today we will explore the specific actions proposed by the Reduction Roadmap, its approach, and the role of policy and regulation in the implementation of such ideas. Reduction Roadmap is initiated by architecture firm EFFEKT, engineering firm MOE, a part of Artelia Group, and architecture office CEBRA. And my guest today is Dani Hill-Hansen. Maybe you can introduce yourself, Dani.
Dani Hill-Hansen, and I'm sitting in the Research and Design and Innovation Department at EFFEKT, working with collaborative research and design projects.
We will explain what the Reduction Roadmap is, what are the specific actions and changes that Reduction Roadmap proposes, how does it differ from other existing initiatives, and what is the role of the policy and regulations, and what can be the first success of such an initiative. Welcome to the newest episode with Dani. I'm so happy, Dani, that you are here. I'm really interested in the Reduction Roadmap that we're gonna discuss today. But maybe before we just dive in, I just would like to ask you for a short introduction. How did you get interested in not only designing, but something beyond? So talking about reducing the emissions in architecture industry, that is unfortunately an industry that puts a lot of emissions outside. And I hope that we are on the right track just to try to reduce them. And this is the topic of this discussion. But before that, please just feel free to introduce yourself and a bit of your work.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Dani Hill-Hansen, and I have been with EFFEKT for almost a year now. And to start at EFFEKT, I was primarily working on the Reduction Roadmap project when I first came on board last year in April. But before that, a long time ago, when I was studying even in my bachelor in the US, American, that was focused on sustainability and interior design. So that was more looking at material health and indoor air quality and what makes buildings healthy from the inside, with the focus on, sustainability, certifications and that kind of thing. And then I got a master's of architecture, the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, also in the US, which was focused on organic architecture, which is looking at landscape integration, passive design strategies, using regional building materials and kind of drawing inspiration from the place in which you design. So I've kind of been scaling up when it comes to sustainability. And then a few years ago, I was teaching about sustainability to architecture students, but working in regular architecture projects on the side. And for me, there was too big of a gap between what I was teaching and what I was practicing. And I felt in order for me to actually change the building industry and set it in the direction I knew we needed to go, I had to get some more tools. So I actually went to Aalborg University here in Copenhagen and got a second master's degree in sustainable design engineering, which is focused on systems change and transition studies and how to kind of zoom out beyond the building and understand like the much bigger scale of sustainability and climate change issues and how to contextualize like the big issue within a small project. So that's kind of what has brought me to sustainability, over the last, 13 years.
And if you, of course, from your own experience, think of those two, so the practice and academia, which of those two, according to your experience, is more forward-leaning? And which one of those two is rather catching up?
I think that there is particular actors in both spaces that are very forward-leaning and that are driving innovation. And it's often projects where you have academic actors, like researchers and that kind of thing, coming together with those of us who sit in the industry and practice to make innovation projects, because the people who only sit in academia also have a very bureaucratic system where they can't be political, where they can't take certain decisions because of the context which they work. Where in architecture, we can actually do demonstration projects. We can actually try things out. And of course, we need to also have developers and clients that are ambitious and like-minded to see those projects through, but we can actually show a proof of concept. But like, the reduction roadmap is a very good example of asking a big question: how could we build within planetary boundaries? We might have a lot of knowledge on bio-based materials and sustainable construction and circular economy, but we don't know how to allocate planetary boundaries down to a measurable target. So then we have to actually work with climate scientists and people who are sitting with this focus on climate change or absolute sustainability and take their knowledge and translate it into something useful for our industry. So I think there's front runners in both places, actually.
So it's about, as I understand, bridging the gap between those two. And this is something I think that you do in the reduction roadmap, which is this tool, the project, the statement, which was basically developed in this cross-sectoral partnership.
Yes.
And that's, I think, a good moment to introduce the reduction roadmap. So could you tell me and the listeners what the reduction roadmap actually is?
Yeah. So as you said, it's the result of a cross-sectoral collaboration. What the reduction roadmap does is set specific reduction targets for the building industry so that we can actually scale our building impact within planetary boundaries here in Denmark. It's a target, it's a framework, it's a call to action, and it's a timeline. So we've basically taken knowledge and data that's well documented in a climate change context of the IPCC report and the Paris Agreement, and translated that into specific targets we can use in the building industry to reduce emissions of our buildings.
Something that I really take care of in this podcast, I hope, is to use this accessible knowledge and accessible language also to introduce those. So can we just say very briefly what is the definition of both the planetary boundaries and what exactly is the Paris Agreement that you refer to?
I will do my best because the definitions on these things are quite specific. But in general, in a general sense, general language, the planetary boundaries framework is illustration that was created by the Stockholm Resiliency Institute. And normally when we talk about the roadmap, we have like wonderful slides that show these things because it's really a visual language. So I'll do my best.
We can add a link later
yeah, we
to
can
the
add
episode
a link,
description.
exactly.
Because I know it might be a challenge to introduce those concepts in a podcast, but let's do our best.
Yes. So the planetary boundaries framework looks at 9 Earth systems, and it shows how close we are to operating within Earth's limits. So if you imagine a circle in the center, there's the Earth, and that's our safe operating space for humanity. When we're in the safe operating space, our consumption and production and what we take from the Earth is within the limits and the ability for the Earth to regenerate, right? So across these 9 different systems, one of them is biodiversity. We have climate change. We have acidification of the ocean. We have a range where we get beyond a certain tipping point or a threshold. And once we've reached that, it's very hard for Earth to rebalance those systems. So today we have reached 6 out of 9 planetary tipping points. So we are in a bit of a crisis, as we maybe know. And this framework makes it visualizes these systems and gives sort of a language to kind of understand where we are in terms of where we should be. So that is kind of the planetary boundary framework.
Is that something that Kate Ravensworth is relating to with her donut economics? Is that the same model?
Yes. The donut economics has the planetary boundaries on the outside of the donut, and then the inside of the donut is a social foundation, and that's built on the Sustainable Development Goals, the 15 SDGs, or 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And those were the result of the Paris Agreement, which was one of these big climate conferences, meetings that happen every few years where world leaders come together and set new climate plans and targets for reducing our impact. And the Sustainable Development Goals have set a trajectory across different categories for saying this is where we want to go. The major criticism of the Paris Agreement and the result, which is these SDGs, is that those are very relative. So they don't have specific targets included in them. What that means is that you can say, okay, we are following one of these SDGs in our organization, but it's not actually setting a direction. It's saying this is something we want to work on to get a little bit better, but it's relative. So what the planetary boundaries does is actually give us absolute limits through climate change science, where we know exactly how much of a carbon budget we have left to use. And so what we've tried to do is say, okay, Denmark has committed to the Paris Agreement. We have national reduction targets. One of the ways those reduction targets is made visible in our industry, in the building industry, is that we now have carbon limits set for our building construction from 2023 forward, where we will step down the allowable amount of carbon in our building projects. What we have done is try to say, is that target good enough? And can we build within these absolute limits?
I think you just touched on the very important point, which is the feasibility and how to measure those actions. Because, of course, what happened in Paris a couple of years ago is that we had this kind of an agreement that we are not in a very good position and that need to do some actions towards, making our impact, the harmful impact on the planet, a bit less harmful, and ideally to just return to the state in which we were not harassing the planet and producing so much carbon emissions.
Yes.
But do you have any ideas, besides from what you just said, on how those actions and changes can be measured? And how is your project, the reduction roadmap, taking those into consideration?
Yeah. So what we've tried to do is develop an absolutely sustainable framework for measuring building impact. So what that means is that we can actually, if we say we're going to follow the Paris Agreement and we're going to scale our building operations within planetary boundaries, we need specific targets to do that because we have a global carbon budget. What that means is you can take that global carbon budget and you can scale it down to a country. So we scaled it down to Denmark. Then you can look at what we did is look at how many buildings are we building each year?
Too many.
Yeah, too many is the answer, yes. Way too many. How many square meters of new housing do we have each year? What percentage do we typically do? And then we get a number kind of saying, okay, this is the limit we have for, or where we have been for housing. And then we can scale that down to square meter of building. And then we have to use a 50-year reference period, which is what we are using in life cycle assessment. So we did this for the carbon budget for climate change, which is how we measure impact in the building industry, which is kilos of carbon per square meter per year. And the climate change impact of the 9 planetary boundaries is the one that is most directly related to our activities in the building industry. So we started there. In the next phase and chapter of the roadmap, we'll be opening up the discussion so we can also look at other things like biodiversity, which is also heavily impacted by our industry, but it's measured in a different way than we do buildings.
And how does that differ from other existing initiatives? Because as you just mentioned before, we should all be working towards reduction overall. And there are, of course, many different initiatives. So what is the special about the reduction roadmap?
It's based on a budget. So most of our sustainability initiatives, whether they're on a government level, like, the national reduction ambitions to the building industry, where we look at different certification schemes like DGNB in Denmark, or if we go to other countries, maybe we have BREEAM or LEED. These are based on relative sustainability, which basically says we'll do a little bit better. So we can say we have option A and B is a little bit better, which means we're heading in the right direction. But what those frameworks don't do is tell us how far off we are from an actual budget. So what we did in this project was find out what is the global carbon budget remaining for a 1.5 warming degree scenario, which is sort of the target of the Paris Agreement, that we do not exceed this limit. So we took a specific budget, and then through the process of allocation, which is basically giving shares to different things, so a share to Denmark, and then a share of that to new housing, then a share to the square meter, then we have a specific budget-based target compared to alternatives which are relative.
What would need to happen for the building industry overall to not exceed those limits? I think it's such a complicated topic because we have the building industry in Denmark, we have the building industries in all different countries.
Yeah.
And of course, some of them are probably more progressive, some of them are less progressive. And have you thought about that? So basically how to approach, how to convince, and how to make this change happen? Oh, I know it's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah. I mean, if we start on just like the how, I think we have to get people to understand the why. Like if we continue building as we do today with the same amount of emissions and the same rate of construction, we will use up this global budget in 5 years.
That's not a lot.
That's not a lot. That's the global carbon budget for all of time for us to stay within a safe zone or low risk zone when we look at the planetary boundary for climate change. So it's like the more we go over the budget, the higher risk we're taking with our chances for living on planet Earth in the next decade, in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years, and so on. So it's like we kind of know from a one planet perspective that we are using more planets each year. Like maybe you have heard of Earth Overshoot Day, where each year, in Denmark is something like in March, we used up our planetary boundaries for this year in March. And that means after that, we're spending future generations' resources, more or less.
So it's basically earlier and earlier each year.
Yes, it's earlier and earlier each year because we have a growth-dependent economy, which means our consumption and production must grow a little bit each year and be in a steady state of growth all the time. And what we know from, the latest IPCC report, and we know from other UN reports, is that if we do not degrow our economy, we will not be able to live here. And so that's a big challenge for our industry because we are in the business of making things, right? So when you ask, how can we actually do it? Well, we have to find more clever ways of creating the things we need. And a lot of that comes down to how we actually distribute our resources. Like you could say almost everyone here, if we use Denmark as the example, has the things they need for a good, comfortable life. And we've had that for a long time. And our rate of happiness hasn't really increased, but our rate of consumption has continued to grow. And our rate of, wealth consumption has continued to grow at the expense of people in other places. So if we, as an industry in Denmark, or really anywhere in the global north, want to change what we're doing, we have to kind of expand our mindset on what is sustainable from a ecological point of view, but also social. Like you could have the most sustainable, low carbon building here in Copenhagen. What if the consumption of those materials and the construction of that building ruin someone else's chance at a good life in a faraway place, then it is not sustainable. And so we have to kind of open up the perspective to say, is it sustainable if it's at the expense of someone else in another place?
The Earth Overshoot Day that you've mentioned, it's pretty sad and depressing that basically the day happens earlier and earlier.
Yeah.
And now it's at the point that basically the spring is not even starting and we already are more or less exceeding the limit.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you've just mentioned is this overconsumption. And at the beginning of this year, 2023, I've heard that there was some discussion and debate starting already in Poland, which is about the comfort. And I don't know if you know, there is a very knowledgeable person called Professor Barber from a university in Australia. And he was talking a lot about the role of comfort, that basically if we would like to meet the goals also that you've mentioned is about decreasing the comfort or maybe rethinking the comfort.
Yeah.
And I think that this is such a big challenge because like people are, especially if we discuss the people living in Europe or in northern countries, in wealthy countries, wealthy economies, we strive for more and more comfort, for bigger apartments, better equipped apartments, for newer, better cars and new gadgets and so on and so on. What's your take on comfort? Is that something that you've also maybe thought about while working with the reduction map?
Yeah. You know, you could say the allocation approach we took in Denmark assumes we continue doing what we do today. And that was the most implementable and strategic way we could do it. It also aligned with the way Danish politics and government has kind of looked at allocation. So we could actually compare the roadmap to national policy. With that being said, we really have to change our mindset of comfort. Like, what do we need? What would allocation look like if it was built on sufficiency? Like, what is enough? What is enough shelter? What are enough things? How much food and water do we need to have a nutrient-rich diet? I mean, it's always goes far beyond the building when we talk about allocation, because we have to think about all the other types of resources we need. In the roadmap, we look specifically at the building, but when we start to look at levels of sufficiency and, what do you need to be happy? Do more things make us happy? My feeling is they don't. But, we live in a consumer society that has told us and told everyone else that more is better and growth is good, and that the more we get, the better off we are. And we don't often stop. Most of us are too busy in our jobs having to get that money to really stop and think about, okay, when am I most joyful? Is it the week I go camping with my family and turn my phone off? Do we really need all of this complexity and stuff in our life to have a good life and to be well and to be healthy? And I think my feeling is like, no, no, we don't. It's simple. But we live in a society that is built on this growth dominant paradigm. So we have to challenge it. And when we bring that back to the building industry, we have to challenge, how much do we actually need to build? Do we need to build new? Should we be building new housing that people can't afford and sits empty? We have to take some serious discussions about what types of buildings we should build in the future. Should we be building bigger and bigger homes? Probably not. Should we, when we do a municipal building or a school, what other functions can that building do? So it's not just about doing less or building less or having less, but it's also about doing more with less, being smarter and being more resource efficient in the way we plan things so that we aren't, consuming at the rate we do today.
I want to reflect on that here a bit. We will have a book recommendation corner at the end of this episode, but I just wanted to mention two titles that are really relevant to what you just said. One of them is about rethinking the attitude and approach to the food we consume. This is a book called Zootopia by Caroline Steele, a UK-based architect. And this is a book I really, really, really love because it tells a lot about like how the cities were constructed around the food and how we should kind of rethink the way we treat the food, which basically became a commodity and something that we just pay and eat, and we don't even think of it anymore. And the second thing is the founder of Kickstarter, the platform that helps some ideas to grow and collect money and develop, basically. He wrote a book called This Is Our Future. I was extremely astonished while reading, because he was basically saying the same. So we need to rethink the way how we develop and how the consumerism is basically destroying us. And we've been taught that this is the way to go, because like both me and you probably, we've been born around the time that basically there was no other thing. It was just like development, eating as much, consuming as much, and taking as much just to develop everything. So these were just 2 recommendations, because I think that those were the books that really helped me to be maybe more aware and conscious about those things that we've just discussed. But let's come back to the reduction roadmap and basically the role of the policy and regulations, because one thing is creating such a device, and this is already, I think, a good step, because you had this cross-sectoral partnership. So it's not only like boiling down within this small still architecture industry, but it's reaching out. But I think that we will not move on, we will not go further without the political actors and the regulations. So what those two, so the policy and regulations, what role do they play in the reductions roadmap approach?
I mentioned a little bit about how we when we thought about how to do the allocation and the roadmap, we thought about 2 things. What are the emission reduction targets in Denmark from this year moving forward that we'll see a decrease in every few years? But also, how do we measure things in Denmark? So we now have a set method, building LCA, for how we actually calculate building impact. So we had to you could say, design the roadmap sitting between those 2 contexts and what we know about our average impact of buildings. So we based our study on a report that came out of BUILD, which is a research division at Aalborg University. They're working in close collaboration with the people who are setting policy for the building industry, and they did a study of 60 building typologies and looked at the average level emissions for those buildings, mainly looking at residential. Some of the projects were offices. And what they found out is that the average emissions per square meter per year is around 9.6 kilos of carbon for a residential typology. What we have set as a limit from this year is 12 kilos of carbon per square meter per year. So what this means is that our building regulations are, 1, set above the average, and people do not have to do anything, really. Maybe a few building typologies will struggle, but in general, most of the construction that happens won't really need to change any of their practices for the next 2 to 4 years before they actually have to start reducing their emissions. So business as usual for the foreseeable future. And the shame is that, like in Denmark, we are usually on the forefront of sustainability things. And we are leading the way about how to do things. And we are one of the, I think, if not the only country that has set a limit for carbon in the building industry. So that's a good thing. But when that limit makes it possible to continue with business as usual, then it's just kind of like national greenwashing, and we need to do better. So when we looked at the reduction targets set by the roadmap, which are aligned with the Paris Agreement and Denmark's national commitment to carbon reduction, and those are sitting considerably under the legal level of carbon emissions in the building industry, we can see that there's been a big misunderstanding between setting reduction targets based on a percentage to do a little bit better than we used to, compared to setting targets based on the finite budget that we have. We need our politicians to understand this. We need them to set stricter requirements. And in the future, we need to have a limit to how many buildings are built. We must. If it is open, we will continue to grow unless there are limits set on how much we can build each year. And, we designed the roadmap looking at assuming we have a constant rate of construction, which means we have to go really far down to 0.4 kilos of carbon per square meter per year. That's a 96% reduction from the average. But if we were to cut the amount we build in half, that number would go up to 1.7 approximate kilos of carbon per square meter per year. Today, we have projects at Effekt and some other cases from 421 Planet where we are around 2.5 kilos of carbon using typical building materials that you can get at, Stack or Bauhaus. So it's like without any material innovation, we can get really low already in most residential construction. So the point being is like we need to have stricter limits and we can't wait for them to be set. We have to act now. This roadmap is hopefully a call to action to a lot of people, but we also need those limits to be set.
To stand firmly on the ground, let's talk about the feasibility.
Yeah.
So basically how to make it feasible in a way that always, I think, with such an initiatives and ideas, there is the question of the financing.
Yeah.
So basically, what do you think that would be this first step towards financing such an initiative, and who should be maybe on the forefront of those changes? Is it the material producers, or is it, as we've mentioned already, those who are making the policy and regulations, or should it be the architects who are pitching and just showing how important it is? Should it be a kind of society as a whole, maybe, who gets convinced to such a change?
I mean, transition literature would tell us that sustainable transition needs to happen from the bottom up and top down simultaneously. So that means it's you and I having this discussion on your podcast and asking people to go and find out what the roadmap is, but it's also fighting and arguing for stricter policy. So it needs to happen in both ways. I think we need to, in general, change our mindset around risk. It's like we have so many wonderful, beautiful solutions for bio-based, low-carbon materials, but they have a really hard time competing with the business-as-usual, regular construction materials. So it's expensive for them to stay on the market, and building owners are a bit concerned about using these novel, in quotes, materials in the construction of their project because of perceived risk when it comes to fire safety and these kinds of things. But it's like, if we just take like the bio-based material as one example, if you look around Copenhagen even, we have examples everywhere of buildings that have stood for 200, 300 years that are a mix of different types of bio-based construction. And they're still there and they're okay. And people can still use those buildings. So we have to kind of balance the risk, which is a big driver in the building industry, managing risk, thinking about, okay, short term, there might be a risk because we're going to try new materials. And that's maybe a risk for the architects and it's a risk for the owners. But the long-term risk is that we don't have any materials to use and that we're in a state of panic. So it's like we can either do things in a very controlled and democratic and planned out systemic way of changing across the material value chain. So that's the suppliers, that's the designers, that's the building owners, that's the municipality. It's everybody who's involved. We can work together to be strategic and planned for low carbon construction now, or in 5 to 10 years, it's going to happen anyways because we're going to be in a state of panic. So it's like we have to work together in order to reach the targets put out in the roadmap. For now, with a project like Living Places, we are like 7 years ahead of the roadmap reductions using typical building materials, typical construction, very little innovation, just kind of being pragmatic and using life cycle assessment as part of our design process. So we can do it. We can stay within the roadmap, but we really need people to have the will and the desire to do it. We need to speak up about it, I think.
So what would be the first big success, the success story in implementing the reduction roadmaps approach?
One big success is that when we came out with it, we were very concerned that people would be uber critical of the targets and very skeptical of it. People have not been that. People have been receptive. And in general, they have said, okay, how do we do it? So there is a willingness and a desire to operate within planetary boundaries. We want it. People want it. We just need the pathway there. In terms of like implementing the roadmap in a strategic way, we have DG and B have adopted the roadmap in their new planet certification. So it's actually being used as part of this building certification, which is very good news. So that means that there will actually be, climate targets that are more ambitious than the building codes as part of the DG and B certification moving forward. So that is one big success there, because something like, I think, 40% of new buildings that are built each year are going through DG and B certification. So they have a powerful role in what the industry perceives as sustainable and like the forward stepping action.
I think that certifications in general, it's also an interesting topic. Sometimes it's also a bit controversial because of, for example, the limits, right? The low limits, the low standards that the building has to achieve to get this certification, get this shiny sticker or shiny mark. So, of course, this is something that is a deep topic. And I've also been discussing about the certifications with CEO of the Danish Green Building Council. Yeah. And it was released not that long ago, so
I listened.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I heard that conversation. Yeah.
Perfect. So if someone would like to get to know a bit more about the certifications, I will just recommend this episode. And here is also one more question, and I'm proud of this question because it's a nice wordplay. So speaking about all this production roadmap, what is the desired effect for effect?
Okay, yes. We want other people in other places, so in our industry, in other industries in Denmark and in other countries, to take ownership of the roadmap and use it. So one desired effect is that people engage with it and take ownership. We have open sourced it, and we want other people to see it as a way of framing their necessary reductions. A second effect, of course, from that is that we get to do more of the exciting projects that actually land us in the roadmap, that we can continue working with collaborators from across different sectors to push building projects so we can get closer and closer to actually being regenerative. I mean, like the ultimate goal is that building projects can be a part of the solution and actually be good for the planet. We're not there yet. The roadmap is to get us to this safe operating space where the Earth can at least balance. But like the next target beyond that is that we actually can begin healing the Earth. And if architects and Effekt can play a role in healing the Earth, that would be a major success.
I think this is also a good moment to ask you for the last thing, which is still about inspiration, as you've just said as well. What is your desired effect? So a book recommendation. I've recommended 2 books already, but you are the guest. So I think that this is now time and space for you to recommend something interesting to the listeners.
I am reading a lot. So I actually have 3 because I couldn't narrow it down to 2, but they're we've touched on the topic. So one is the Climate book by Greta Thunberg. She has put together an amazing collection of essays from top researchers around the world in a really beautiful, clear, articulate guide to understanding what's at stake. The second one is Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World by Jason Hickel, which is looking at the solution and how we can actually go from growth-dependent economy and society to one that works within planetary limits. And the third, I'm putting a little plug. We're working on a book called The Donut for Urban Development, where we are creating a manual that sort of translates the donut economic model defined by Kate Rayworth into a tool that we can use in the building industry. And that's a collaborative project with Home Earth, Donut Economic Action Lab, Stockholm Resiliency Institute, SLA, DTU, Build, Sweco. We have a bunch of, I'm missing some of our collaborators, but it's another example of like a pretty big collaboration. And we are going to launch that in June. So that would be like, just for people to keep their eye open. It's going to be like a very practical way of kind of dealing with these issues through building projects.
Okay, I mean, that sounds very interesting. I will definitely keep in touch around June just to talk about it as well, because I think that this is such a great concept. But for now, I wanted to say, Dani, thank you so much for joining Urbcast and for sharing this. I was really amazed. I really had like so many different questions in my head, and I think that we've managed to answer most of them. But I think that this is such a great topic and big topic, I mean, here, that the discussion should be continued.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm ready to discuss anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast with Dani. And I hope that you also got inspired, because I think that even though this is a huge crisis that we are discussing here, we managed to be still kind of motivating and uplifting in the discussion that we had here. And if you would like to get something more about the reduction roadmap, you can just visit the website reductionroadmap.dk. And also links to the things we've mentioned in the discussion, books and other things will be, I will add it into the episode description. If you would like to get to know something more about Urbcast, I have my website. There is also Instagram, LinkedIn and Facebook. So please write to me there. Thank you and talk to you soon.